The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free.
Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Right now I'm going to attempt to examine the Bible and dissect some of the churchy language we can really easily take for granted, digging into history and languages, as I'm able anyway, to try and get at the heart of the text so that we can see and then apply at least some of what God has for you and me in these words today. Now, I'm not formally trained in Scripture. I'm just a guy using resources and a questioning mind to try and get at the truth, and that's something that we can all do, so I hope that you'll do that with me. We've been studying our way through the book of Colossians and have arrived now at chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, which in the ESV says, "Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." So just looking at that first verse to start, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. The term outsiders here refers to those who are not part of the church. As far as I can tell, the word's not precise enough to indicate whether this would only include non-believers or if it might also include believers who are not attending a local church. Given the first century context in which this was written, far removed from the modern phenomena of casual or isolated Christian faith that exists today, it seems best to treat this as referring to non-believers. It's also important to note that the term outsider has, I think, a negative connotation today, possibly implying, as we use it, someone who is rejected by the group in some sense, that they are outside of. But this is not at all what Paul and the Spirit have in mind. Outsiders are not rejected by God, but are people He wants us to be considerate of. Here are a few other uses of the term outsider in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 5:12 through 13, Paul says, "For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you." And 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, and the ESV says, "Now concerning brotherly love," it takes a little while to get to the word outsider, so hang in there. "Now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. For that indeed is what you were doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one." So all of that instruction is given so that they can walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. 1 Timothy 3:7, last one. In the ESV says, "Moreover," this is the qualifications of an elder being talked about here, "Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil." So outsiders, we see, require special consideration from us. God's desire is that every outsider become an insider by receiving His invitation of forgiveness and adoption into God's family. And our attitude should be the same, even toward those who angrily disagree with what we believe. We're instructed to apply wisdom as we interact with non-believers. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders. We can't afford to merely follow our passions and our feelings, even those that we may assume in the moment are godly. Before making that assumption, in every case, we need to submit ourselves to the principles of wisdom, to be walking in wisdom toward outsiders. The phrase "making the best use of the time" in the Greek came from a marketplace expression meaning to buy out or to purchase completely. I found this very interesting when I learned this. Our time and opportunities with individuals are always limited, and we are meant to fully invest in those opportunities, not merely bring to them what is easy and convenient for us. And as the Greek expression implies, there is a cost involved in totally buying out and purchasing completely these opportunities. In this case, the cost will probably most often be one of patience, energy expended, thoughtfulness, humility, and self-control. Now looking at verse 6, again in the ESV, it says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. The Greek word for gracious here, and used elsewhere in the New Testament, usually refers to God's undeserved favor toward people, but in this context, the word very likely refers to a general concept of undeserved favor that we are to have toward other people in the form of being pleasant or winsome or charming toward those who may not deserve it. Salt was both a preservative and a flavoring when this was written. When we add this idea to the idea of graciousness, it seems clear that the character of our speech toward non-believers should always be intended to appeal and persuade. This stands in stark contrast to the verbal one-upmanship on social media, where everyone just kind of wants to get in the last word, be recognized as right, and there's an attitude maybe of mocking or of just kind of focused on defeating someone's argument, not really thinking about them as a person. But rather, we're really supposed to have a desire to persuade and appeal to a person. As Christians, those who disagree with us should, after interacting with us, be struck by our persuasive warmth and kindness, even in the midst of disagreement. They might think that we're idiots or that we're wrong or whatever, but they should walk away thinking, man, that's a really nice moron. That's a very warm person. I cannot fathom why they think the way that they do, but they're the kind of person that I would like to spend time with. That's really the flavor that should be left with our words. I find it really interesting that verse 6 says that prioritizing this kind of speech actually helps us to know how to answer each person. Let your speech always be gracious, it says, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. When interacting with those I disagree with, I used to be overly focused on the reasoning and the facts that obviously defeated their claims from a logical standpoint. But this verse doesn't instruct us on how to answer each question or how to answer each statement or how to respond to a logical fallacy. It tells us how to answer each person. As some noted Christian apologists have observed, questions don't need answers. People need answers, and they use questions to try and get them. I think the same is true when someone rudely makes a statement we know to be false. In that moment, our first priority should be to figure out how to wisely answer that person, because they're making this inflammatory statement or this really jabbing, cutting question because they're motivated by something that is specific to them and their experience, the way they're wired. And so in that moment, our first priority should be to try to figure out how can I wisely answer this person, while also not neglecting, of course, trying to respond with truth and sound reason. Prioritizing interaction that will be persuasive to the specific individual we are interacting with requires that we think about that individual, their personality, and their passions. Our first concern then is to be helpful and useful rather than being recognized as right. And as we apply that focus well, we will actually be better positioned to help a person discover and accept the truth. And you might find, how do you, when you're responding to a tweet that someone made and you don't know this person at all, how do you think about them as an individual? How do you respond to them, given, in light of their personality and their passions and stuff, when you don't know anything about them? Well, yeah, I think that's a red flag. It may not be wise to even respond at all in those kinds of situations. I'm not saying we should rule those out and never respond, but I'm saying, whoa, okay, that's a real reason to stop and think. So getting then, as you can tell, maybe I'm already heading into the kind of the application point. What's in this passage maybe specifically for us as geeks today? Although interacting through social media like Twitter, forums, email, other mediums, is common for most people in Western society today, online interactions likely make up, I think, I'm just guessing here, a greater percentage of a geek's social life than they do for others. And if I were in the business of publishing Bibles for those using social media, you know how they have like headings above passages or like Paul's appeal to the Corinthians or whatever, before the verses go on. Those are remarks the editor makes. They're not part of the original Greek text, So if I were in the business of publishing Bibles for those using social media, then I would put my own heading above these verses that just says "read before posting" in all caps. I know that kind of heading would have been very helpful to me in the past. It's still really important for me to remember the principle of these verses now before I post. Social media gives us this felt sense of freedom and safety that we don't have when we're talking to people one-on-one. It makes it easier to share our thoughts and our opinions honestly. But as we see in Ephesians 4:15, I'll let you look that up on your own time, a vital part of growing in spiritual maturity is speaking truth in love. It's not truth or love, but truth in love. Valuing the individuals we are speaking to. That's a mark of someone who is growing in their spiritual maturity. And the principle of these verses in Colossians 4 that we are looking at this time calls us to give thoughtfulness and undeserved favor to unbelievers who might read or hear us on social media. These verses also assume interactions with individuals, and so first I think we should prioritize that. The Bible has very little to say about how we should share public statements regarding our moral, doctrinal, or political positions. You can find some application to make, but it's harder to make those points, those connections in application compared to other types of communication, other settings in which we might share what's on our minds. And I think that's likely because God's heart is much more for us to share our lives with individuals than it is to make our position on something publicly known. And there's a major difference between the two. I mean, sometimes we can think to ourselves, part of my ministry in life is to spend some time interacting with certain types of people online. And that absolutely can be ministry. But first and foremost, what we see in Scripture is that ministry is about interacting with individuals. Not public speaking tours, getting tons of clicks on a YouTube channel, or doing other stuff on social media. Those things can be part of it. They can be types of ministry, but primarily what we see, even Jesus, who was speaking very publicly, was always in between those things, making time talking to individuals. There's so much in the gospel accounts about Jesus taking time to speak to individuals, to give himself to individuals. That's the defining characteristic, comparatively, in ministry. Now, that said, I think there is application that we can make from these verses regarding the sort of open letters we are essentially posting when we use various social media platforms. I mean, there's precedent in Scripture itself. Paul is writing these letters, and he'll mention individual names, but he's also writing them to a church or a group of churches or a cross-section of people. And so there's precedent for, obviously, ministry that is in some kind of a open, publicly communicated medium, Of course, it's also really important to remember that Paul's preference was always to be with people. He expressed his longing to be with people that he was writing these letters to. So, but yeah, there is that aspect that can exist and does exist and should exist in different forms of ministry. So with that in mind, as I said, I do think there's application that we can make from these verses regarding those sorts of open letter types of communications that we might do on various social media platforms. I think the principle to apply from this passage should lead us to wisely shape our speech for a broad and wide audience when we are communicating that which can be seen by a wide audience. Now, notice I said that which can be seen by, not when we are communicating to. We might think to ourselves, as I do when I make my content, well, I'm making this for Christians. I'm making my content for Christians to watch, to listen to, but I always have, or try to have, an awareness that there are people going to be checking out my content for whatever their reason might be, who are not Christians. And so I want to be sensitive to that audience as well, even though I'm not prioritizing that as much in my mind as reaching a Christian audience. But my point is, we should factor in the possibility that anybody that technically could have access to what we're to what we're saying, what we're writing, whatever. I think wisdom would also inform us that not all statements can be made in an effectively loving way when speaking to a broad, undefined audience, as is most often the case when we're posting things on Twitter, for example. Some things may only be able to be communicated lovingly by communicating with an individual, one-on-one, in order to tailor words and tone to that specific person. And yes, I think this means that the most controversial hot-button issues of the day should be handled via sensitive, tailored, private discourse much more often than they are tweeted about, for example. It's not that sharing truth on social media is sinful. Don't hear me saying what I'm not. But love for individuals should always be the motive and guiding hand. The next time we post our viewpoint on something, it's worth asking, who specifically am I hoping will see or hear this? Tomorrow also is promised to no one, so am I recognizing this as a precious, potentially very limited opportunity? And am I, in light of that, seasoning my expressiveness with salt, so that this potentially limited, precious opportunity to speak truth is more likely to be received well? Do I feel genuine compassion and love for the one that I am speaking to? And we can apply this, of course, to public posts, but also when we are emailing somebody and they can't see our tone or hear our tone in our voice, but we're sending them an email. We can think, who am I writing this to? What do I know about this person? How can I write this in a way that they will most likely receive well and be influenced by, if my intent is to influence them in some way? If these are challenging questions to answer immediately, because maybe we don't know the person very well, or for whatever the reason might be, or if we can tell that our primary motivation is, in that moment, just frustration and anger. Man, I'm so sick of such and such types of people, and them saying this in public all the time, I got to make my voice heard. I think that's a red flag to hit the brakes and abort for the day, or for a week, or maybe a lot longer. And while we wait, that's the time to pray for God to help us consider the feelings and experiences of the person or persons we want to reach. Maybe we don't see any logical reason for them believing what they do about themselves or about a certain issue, but their feelings are very real. And that shapes their experience, and that shapes how they will or will not respond to certain things that we might choose to say and the ways we might choose to communicate those things. And so it's really valuable to pray for God to help us be thinking about and considering and then gaining knowledge from that, the feelings and experiences of the person or persons that we want to reach, and to develop in that process real compassion and love for them that can shape and give our words true effectiveness. If you would like some help finding a good church in your area, I would love to help you do that if I can. Online resources and communities are good supplements, but by their very nature, they can't speak to your particular situation like relationships in a local church can. The context for almost everything in the New Testament assumes that we are serving and building purposeful relationships in a local church. So whether you're in a church that lacks Bible-based intentionality, or maybe not attending any church at all right now, if I can help you get connected to an authentic, compassionate, Bible-oriented church, I would love to do that. Email me, please, paeter@spiritblade.com, and we can try to look at some websites of churches in your area together.